So when I was asked to give a talk tonight, I was asked to talk on some aspect of the masculine vocation. And so as I was thinking about it, the first thing that really came to my mind was John Paul II's Theology of the Body. I was first introduced to his Theology of the Body while I was in college, especially reading up on some, especially during the summers during my time in college. Theology of the Body, if you don't know, is this kind of catechesis that John Paul II went through during the first 6 years of his pontificate, especially contemplating about what it means to be men and women, how God has made us. And kind of stemming from that, John Paul II actually wrote specifically about the dignity and vocation of women in one of his apostolic letters. But he never wrote a complementary one. He never wrote one on the dignity and vocation of men specifically. So a classmate of mine when I was in the seminary, who's now a priest in St. Louis, Father Henry Purcell, he actually wrote his master's thesis on trying to pull out of the theology of the body what's the dignity and vocation of men in particular. And I don't want to go into all of the theological things that he has in his thesis. So to kind of, with probably simplifying it a bit too much, he saw John Paul II as characterizing the masculine vocation as a gift received from God, which calls a man to generate life by radiating the love of God the Father and accepting the responsibility of the fruit of his work. So that probably doesn't mean anything to you. What is that all about? So if we break that down a little bit, the first thing that's important in there is it says that our vocation as men is determined by God. That's the first part of it. God is the one who decides what our mission is. And we receive it from him. So, which actually is a great relief. That means we don't have to make it up ourselves. He's the one who has made us for a specific mission. So that's the first thing that kind of comes through there. The second thing is that it says we're to radiate, we're to show forth, so through our words and deeds, the very love of God himself, especially in terms of fatherhood. And I find this expressed most beautifully by St. Paul in his letter to the Ephesians, Ephesians chapter 5. He says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church." And even though it's directed specifically at that point to husbands, it actually applies to all of us as men. It doesn't, regardless of whether we're married or not, or in the future called to marriage, or in the future called to priesthood, or it applies to all of us as men. Husband, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So as men, we're supposed to love the way that Jesus loved the church. Well, how did Jesus love the church? Well, he died for her. He died for her. He offered his whole life for her. And so that men, that's our high calling as men, to love even to the point of death. And so when we have certain images, like, for example, in movies, when we have got the hero who offers his life and he puts himself on the line and he even gets close to dying to save the one that he loves, that resonates within our hearts because that's what we're made for. We're made for that kind of love where we would put ourselves on the line for somebody else, to even offer our life for them. But the reality of the way that we live that out is something maybe not as movie-worthy, the way that we're called to live it out. It's not so much dying physically as dying to ourselves, dying to our own selfishness, to serve the ones that God has entrusted to us, whether they be a wife, children, family, friends, for myself, my parishioners, whoever God has entrusted to us. That's who we are to offer our life for. And the third thing he says in there is that we take responsibility for this work. Men have the responsibility to initiate and protect the giving of our whole self, the way that Christ does. So that was a bunch of theological words. So that might not have, you're like, okay, that sounds wonderful, but I still don't know what that really means. Wow. So I think it'd be very helpful to express this quite practically. What does this kind of masculine love look like, rather than just think about it theoretically? Well, John Paul II does point out an example for us to find this. And he points to St. Joseph as being the key to unlock what it is for us to be men. I mentioned that John Paul II, he wrote his letter on the vocation of women, but he never wrote one on the vocation of men. And maybe he did that on purpose, because exactly 1 year after he wrote his letter to women, he wrote a document on St. Joseph called Redemptoris Custos, the guardian of the Redeemer. That's who Joseph is, the guardian of the Redeemer. And so we could say that Joseph is the one who shows us what our vocation as men practically is meant to look like. And so that's why I want to spend a little bit of time reflecting upon St. Joseph and what that teaches us. Because together, Mary and Joseph actually show something about their unique roles, their complementary roles. John Paul II at one point calls it the genius of women, the genius of men. You could, in a sense, say that the genius of women is that kind of receptivity or sensitivity to receiving another person, recognizing their whole person. And our genius as men could say is responsibility, living responsibility. Those are simplified ways of putting it, but but this is really expressed in the responses of Mary and Joseph that we see in the Scriptures. See, when the angel comes to Mary, her response is one with great receptivity, sensitivity to the person of Jesus that's going to be born within her. She receives God's plan, saying, "Let it be done to me according to your word." Whereas St. Joseph is a little bit different. He takes responsibility by immediately doing what God asks of him. And so it says in the Scripture that Joseph did what the angel said. So for Mary, it's let it be done, and for Joseph, he did. So we want to reflect a little bit more on Joseph, and particularly what we might call the Passion of St. Joseph. Another one of my seminary classmates, Father Fadi Aro, he gave a beautiful talk this past year during the year of St. Joseph on the Passion of St. Joseph. We know that Jesus went through his passion upon the cross. We know that Mary had a share in that passion, her kind of compassion, as she was there alongside Jesus. But Joseph had died by that point. So what would Joseph's passion be? Well, Joseph's passion, his cross, was the agony about having to make a decision about his marriage to Mary. This is going to be the moment of his passion. And maybe at first when you hear that, you might be like, well, how is that a passion? I mean, he didn't have to suffer physically or anything. Well, there might have been some physical suffering as part of that. But if you think about it, isn't sometimes trying to figure out the answer to a problem that you don't know, there's something of a suffering there. Trying to decide maybe what your vocation is, what direction that God is calling you to follow. An important decision, maybe a decision that other people are dependent upon you to make that kind of decision. All the things that goes on within us can be quite stressful and agonizing. It's a kind of cross and suffering. And so this is the passion of Joseph. So think about him. Think about Joseph. After the Annunciation, this moment where Jesus is conceived within our Blessed Mother, she leaves in haste to go and visit her cousin Elizabeth, and she stays there for 3 months before she returns back to Nazareth and back to where Joseph is. So what would it have been like to be St. Joseph? He's anxiously awaiting her return. And then she returns, and he discovers, because it can't be hidden anymore, that she's with child. What kind of thoughts went through his mind at that moment? What feelings welled up within his heart? Consider what kind of struggle is now going to take place within Joseph's soul. At first, maybe he might try to convince himself that he's seen things, maybe, but he can't deny it. He can't deny it. The signs are clear. Mary's pregnant. She's with child. And think about maybe how his soul could be shattered, trying to figure out what's happened. And we might even ask the question, did Joseph bring up the thought of that Mary had sinned? Unbelievers, those who don't believe who Jesus is, assume that Jesus was either conceived by Joseph himself or by some other human man. Of course, Joseph knew that he was not the father, But would he have expected Mary, would he considered Mary having committed adultery? Even if that thought would have came in moments of weakness, that would have just briefly crossed his mind. Maybe a temptation that he would have immediately rejected. Perhaps that was part of the agony of that moment, was how could I even contemplate something about her, right? She who's clearly filled with God. But there's some saints, like St. Jerome, who says that no, there was no way that something like that ever crossed Joseph's mind, because Joseph knew Mary. He would sooner believe that the Jordan River could turn back on its course or that the mountains of Hermon could just up and disappear than to believe that Mary had been unfaithful. But then, knowing that, he didn't have any kind of comprehension of what was going on. Right? He knew that the child wasn't his, and he knew that Mary couldn't be unfaithful. And so Joseph knew that in Mary's holiness, somehow this has to be God's doing. Has to be God's doing. But now what is he to do? What is he going to do? He couldn't publicly divorce Mary because that would lead everybody to assume that Mary had sinned and she would be punished for it. And he couldn't allow that to happen. Could not allow that to happen to her. But the option to take Mary as his wife and the child as his own, how could he do that? Because if this really was from God, he felt utterly unworthy to have any part in it. How could he dare to be the father of a child whose origin was of God? It's a mystery that he wasn't worthy to share. And so this is Joseph's moment of trial, and not too far maybe from the moments of trial that we have at different times, when we're trying to figure out what is the best thing to do. God, what is your will? Just difficult decisions that we have to make. And maybe it's even we know finally what the right thing is that we should do, but it's hard. It's difficult. Or maybe doing the right thing means sacrifice, sacrificing something. And so the choices run through our head, and there's this agony. Well, in the midst of this, consider Joseph battling day and night, interiorly, hour after hour, this dilemma. He can't keep Mary, but he can't expose her to shame either, because his loyalty to God forbids him to take either course. And so he seeks for a way that maybe he can set her free and at the same time protect her honor. And he finally comes to a heart-wrenching conclusion, that he would have to leave her quietly. Not because he thought she was guilty, certainly not, but because he was unworthy to play any kind of role in this divine drama. And so that means he's got to return the ring. He's got to send back the wedding gifts. And he has to go away. And that would be a huge sacrifice for Joseph because out of his love for Mary to have to leave her. But if he would do this, he would be blamed for cowardly behavior as a husband abandoning his wife. He would be blamed. But no blame would fall on her. None would fall on her. And so it was truly an act of selfless love. And so imagine Joseph having worked out his plan and putting off its execution because it's just too painful the way we might put things off. He tries to pack his bag, and tears are in his eyes about having to leave her, and exhausted with his decision-making, God mercifully allows him to fall into sleep. And suddenly, as he sleeps, the angel of the Lord appears to him. Do not be afraid, Joseph, son of David, to take Mary as your wife, for that which is in her is of the Holy Spirit, and she shall bring forth a son, and you shall name him Jesus. And so this is the answer to Joseph's fears. He now knows that this child is indeed God's. I mean, it's a mystery beyond his understanding. The child is God. And his fear of being unworthy and remaining with Mary and is taken away because he's called a son of David. He is of royal line, royal dignity. And in telling Joseph to give Jesus his name, it meant that Joseph is being accepted and called by God to take on the duties of being Jesus' foster father. So Joseph You're so much more in God's sight. You have such a greater role in God's plan than you think you do. And sometimes that's where our struggles are at too. We're like Joseph that way. We don't think that God would really be asking us to do great things for him. I personally struggled with that when I entered in the seminary. How could God want me with all my faults? But like you and I, Joseph, each of us are so much more in God's sight than we think we are. And God does call us to follow him. So Joseph's fear of intruding upon this special privilege that God was giving to Mary, it's removed at this moment. And that's all Joseph needed to know. He didn't need to know all the other details about what was going to happen. Well, this was enough. He simply did as the angel commanded, and he took his wife into his home. And that's often how our own fears and anxieties can be eliminated, how we can make it through our own crosses and sufferings when we, like Joseph, trust God in that much. In fact, that's really the great genius of men, is that we're made to take that kind of responsibility. That once we know the will of God, even if it's only the next step, rather than several steps, once we know what it is that he wants of us, then we do it without delay. And that it leads me to considering another image that I've found helpful about this aspect of the masculine vocation. The last couple of years in our area, we've had a retreat for boys called the Legion of St. Joseph. And I love the name. There's a lot in it to ponder about what it means. So, a legion. A legion was the largest military unit of the Roman army, which was one of the most significant fighting forces that the world has seen. And legionary soldiers were known for their loyalty, their courage, their discipline, their endurance, their success. And the legion soldier had this unquestioning obedience to their commanding officer. They were ready to obey ad nutum, which means at the nod. And so they all moved together at the nod of their commander for a sole purpose, bound to one another. And that led to their great success. So we can consider that for ourselves. We see this kind of attitude actually described in the Scriptures, this acting at the nod, ad nutum. The Roman centurion that Jesus meets in Matthew's Gospel. The centurion has faith that Jesus, all he needs to do is say the word, and his servant will be healed. Because he says, "For I too am a person subject to authority, with soldiers subject to me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come here,' and he comes, and to my slave, 'Do this,' and he does it." See, the centurion knew that all he had to do is say the word, and the people under him would move. And so he had faith that if his soldiers act ad nutum, so too would Jesus' army act at the moment that the Lord calls upon us. And so that's an analogy for us as soldiers in God's army. We who must fight and protect those who are and will be entrusted to us, to protect them from the enemy, which of course is the devil and his angels. And so we can see St. Joseph as really commander in God's army. He's like the primus pilus, the first spear, the head centurion, because Joseph was the first called to take care of and protect Mary and Jesus. And Joseph is the greatest example of being ready to obey God ad nutum, at the nod. When he awoke, Joseph did as the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary into his home. The moment he knew God's will, he did it. And we see it repeated each time. Same thing happened when Joseph was told to flee to Egypt. Joseph rose in the night, and he took the child and his mother into Egypt. And there they stayed until the death of Herod. There's a beautiful meditation on this that comes from the Akathist hymn to St. Joseph. It's kind of an Eastern prayer, and so they're oftentimes very elaborate in their prayers. But this just one little portion where it reflects on this. It says, "Desiring to save from the malice of Herod him who had come to save the world, O wondrous Joseph, thou didst not question the angel who commanded thee to flee to Egypt, saying, 'Could he who saveth others not save himself?' But being a man of faith, like a new Abraham, ever ready for obedience, giving no thought to the rigors of the journey, nor considering the time of return, thou didst straightway betake thyself to Egypt with Mary and the babe, joyously crying out to God, Hallelujah. It's just such a beautiful reflection. Putting no thought to the rigors of the journey. No thought to, but what if this happens? Well, what if this happens? Which we often do ourselves, don't we? Whenever Joseph receives instructions from God, the text tells us that he did exactly as God commanded him. And that's precisely where the masculine vocation, the genius of men, lies. To take responsibility and to act immediately in obedience when God asks something of us. To die to ourselves and instead care for and protect our bride, our family that's entrusted to us. And this really helps us understand why St. Joseph is called the terror of demons. It's one of his titles. It's called the terror of demons because the enemy is powerless against those who do God's will at the nod. The demons fell from heaven because they refused to do God's will. They refused his will. They were the first to reject Jesus. The demons want nothing more than for us to also refuse to do God's will. But Joseph and we men are called to respond to God at nutum, at the nod. And that is the enemy's worst nightmare. St. Ignatius of Loyola, his Discernment of Spirits speaks about the different tactics, some of the tactics that the enemy has. And one of his rules, Rule 12, says that if you confront a temptation firmly, doing what's opposed to the temptation, then the enemy will lose heart, weaken, and flee, and stop the temptation. He runs away when we act according to God's will immediately. But he says if we're afraid and we lose heart and we begin to waver and to begin to think about, well, maybe it would be okay for me to do that, then the temptation, the ferocity of an attack will occur. And the longer we delay, the more power he will have over us, and the more easily it is to fall into the temptation. But the sooner that we obey God, the easier the victory will be. It's indeed those rules of discernment that can give us practical principles of how to understand God's will, because that's sometimes the thing that we struggle with. Just like Joseph had to struggle with understanding what was God's will. I would follow your will, God, but I don't know what it is yet. And so the discernment of spirits actually are beautiful practical principles to try to help us understand God's will so we can act upon it. But then there's also sometimes when we're faced with things that we can't control. And we try to understand what God's will is in those. And there's one last kind of set of reflections. This comes from an American Jesuit priest, Father Walter Ciszek. Father Ciszek felt called to go and serve people in Russia during World War II, but instead he ended up being captured and convicted of being a Vatican spy and was sent to work camps in Siberia for 23 years. And so he had to deal with the fact that he thought God had called him to go and serve in one way, but that didn't happen that way. And so he had to deal with the interior frustration of, but I wanted to do something good for you, Lord. And so some of his words that he says, our dilemma came from our frustration and not being able to do what we thought the will of God ought to be in this situation. At our inability to work as we thought God would surely want us to work, instead of accepting the situation itself as his will. It's a mistake easily made by every man, saint or scholar, church leader or day laborer. Ultimately, we come to expect God to accept our understanding of what his will ought to be and help us to fulfill that, instead of learning to see and accept his will in the real situations in which he places us daily. So this, I think, is oftentimes a struggle for us. We want to do God's will, but when we go through our time of discernment, we come to okay, I'm very certain that this is what you want of me, God. And then when unforeseen circumstances come that stop us from being able to fulfill it, then we can get frustrated, isn't this what you wanted of me, God? But Father Ciszek says that the solution and how he was able to come to peace, spending that time in the prison camps, is, he says, accepting what actually was going on as being God's will. That maybe, God, it wasn't your will that I serve in all these ways that I thought you were going to call me to serve. But instead, here where I am right now, and the people that I'm with, this is your will for me. This is what you're calling me to do. He says the plain and simple truth is that his will is what he actually wills to send us each day in the way of the circumstances, places, and people and problems. And the trick, of course, is to see that, not just at certain moments, but to live out of that each day. Each of us, he says, has no need to wonder about what God's will must be for us. His will for us is clearly revealed in every situation of every day, if only we could learn to view all things as he sees them and sends them to us. Now, this applies to St. Joseph too, right? St. Joseph had certain ideas of what God's will was, to take Mary as his wife, but that was before everything changed, that he had no control over, right? He had no control over that. Now she's with child. And so he has to work through and learn to see in this situation that this is precisely where God's will is, right? And that's what will bring, Father Ciszek says it's far from easy in execution. It's really easy in concept, that we can find God's will basically in whatever happens. It's easy in concept, but hard to actually live out. But that's why it requires us to be men of prayer. The only reason why Joseph was able to, when he finally heard God's will, the only way he was able to do it is because he was already a just man, living in a relationship with the Lord. And so that's the same way. We can bring all of the things that are going on, all those interior struggles like Joseph had, right? Bring them here, especially before our Lord in the Eucharist. And ask him to give us the clarity to know what it is that our will is, and then that fortitude to, like Joseph, to be able to do it.